In the frozen winter of 1944, when Europe was drowning in chaos and the lines between life and death blurred with every gunshot, one man made a decision that no commander would ever authorize, and no soldier could ever forget. His unit was stranded deep behind enemy lines, cut off after a disastrous ambush, supplies gone, radios dead, and the German patrols were closing in. Most would have called it hopeless, but not Sergeant Daniel Harrow. With nothing but a torn map, a rifle with 5 bullets, and a promise to his men, he began walking, alone, across miles of Nazi-occupied territory, not to save himself, but to bring them home. This is the story of one soldier's impossible journey, a march through hell that no one believed he could survive. But as history would later reveal, it wasn't courage that kept him alive. It was something far deeper. The night Daniel Harrow began his journey, the forest was so quiet it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. Snow blanketed the ground in thick, uneven layers, muffling every footstep, every crack of a branch beneath his boots. Somewhere behind him, miles back, his men were hidden in the cellar of an abandoned farmhouse, wounded, starving, and waiting. He had promised them he'd return with help. None of them truly believed he would make it through enemy lines, but Daniel's eyes had carried something fierce, something that made even disbelief fall silent. He walked without light, guided only by a torn corner of a German map he had scavenged from a fallen officer. The names of towns were in a language he couldn't read, the ink half smeared with mud and blood, yet it was the only chance they had. Every few miles he stopped to listen, to the crunch of boots, the low growl of an engine, or the whistle of a distant patrol. The cold bit through his jacket like teeth, but the thought of his men, faces pale and broken, whispering prayers in the dark, drove him forward. By dawn, he reached the edge of a ravaged village. Smoke still rose from chimneys shattered by artillery fire. The streets were empty, save for the wind-stirring papers and the faint creak of a swinging sign. Daniel crouched behind a ruined wall, scanning for movement. He could see German helmets in the distance, 2 soldiers guarding a checkpoint near a burned-out truck. Between him and them lay open ground, no cover. He waited. When one soldier turned away to light a cigarette, Daniel crawled through the snow inch by inch until he found an alley that led deeper into the village. Inside what had once been a bakery, he found a young woman, perhaps no older than 20, clutching a child in her arms. Her eyes widened when she saw him, his uniform caked in ice, his breath ragged. But instead of screaming, she raised a finger to her lips. "Englander," she whispered. Daniel nodded. She motioned for him to hide behind a collapsed counter, just as the sound of boots echoed outside. 2 German soldiers entered, speaking rapidly, searching the building. The woman stood tall, heart pounding, and answered them in calm, practiced tones. They looked around for a few seconds, muttered something about ghosts in the snow, and left. When the door closed, Daniel exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The woman handed him a piece of stale bread and pointed toward the north, tracing the air with her finger. "Forest, then river. Go at night." She smiled faintly, eyes tired, then added, "For your brothers." He nodded, unable to speak. In that frozen silence, he realized war had destroyed nations, but not kindness. The forest beyond the village was thicker and darker than before. The trees leaned like sentinels, their branches heavy with frost. Daniel trudged through snow that came up to his knees, every step an act of will. His legs trembled and hunger burned in his stomach. Once he stopped by a frozen stream and cracked the ice with his rifle butt just to drink. The water tasted like metal, but it kept him moving. He knew if he stopped too long, he'd never get back up again. At night, he built small fires buried in snow pits, just enough to warm his fingers without revealing smoke. He thought of his men, Corporal Jenkins with his wounded leg, Private Miller who kept talking about home, and young Thomas, barely 19, who still wore his mother's rosary under his shirt. Daniel could almost hear them whispering in the dark, waiting for him. 3 days passed before he reached the first German supply route. From the ridge, he watched convoys moving like steel serpents through the valley, trucks, tanks, and columns of soldiers heading toward the front. He needed to cross that road to reach friendly lines. Timing would be everything. That night, as snow began to fall again, he waited for a lull in movement. When the last truck passed and the sound of engines faded, he sprinted. Halfway across, a shout split the night. "Halt! Gunfire erupted, tearing into the snow around him. He dove behind a ditch, rolling into the frozen mud. A bullet grazed his sleeve, slicing the fabric but missing flesh. He pressed himself flat, barely breathing as flashlights swept over the road. Minutes dragged like hours. Then, as quickly as it began, the patrol moved on, assuming he had been hit. Daniel crawled through the drainage ditch until his hands bled, then vanished back into the forest. By the fifth day, exhaustion clawed at him. He had eaten nothing but snow and roots, his vision blurring from lack of sleep. He could no longer tell if the shapes in the trees were real or ghosts. In the distance, he began to see flashes of artillery, faint orange pulses on the horizon. Allied lines had to be close. That hope, thin, fragile, kept his legs moving even when every part of his body screamed to stop. Near dusk, he came across another ruin, an old church half swallowed by snow. Inside, he found shelter among broken pews. He also found bodies, German soldiers, frozen where they had fallen, their faces pale as wax. He scavenged a blanket and a few rations, his hands trembling. As he sat by the altar, staring at the dim light filtering through cracked glass, he whispered to himself, "One more day." His voice echoed in the emptiness like a vow. The next morning, he set out again, slower now, limping from frostbite. His rifle hung across his back, more a symbol than a weapon. The land began to slope downward, and soon he could hear distant engines, American ones this time. Hope surged through him like fire, but between him and those sounds was a river, wide and black, half frozen. Crossing it would be suicide, but turning back wasn't an option. Daniel wrapped his scarf tighter and stepped into the icy water. Pain exploded through him instantly, like knives piercing his skin. The current pulled hard, dragging him beneath chunks of floating ice. He fought, kicking and clawing until his arms went numb. His rifle slipped away. For a moment he thought of letting go, of letting the cold take him. But then he saw their faces again, his men waiting in that dark cellar. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward. When he reached the far bank, he collapsed in the mud, gasping. The world swayed above him. He tried to stand and fell again, laughing weakly. "Still breathing," he muttered. Somewhere nearby, a voice shouted, English clear as a bell. "Hold it, identify yourself." Daniel raised his hand, barely able to lift it. "Sergeant Daniel Harrow, 3rd Battalion, my men. They're still out there." Before he blacked out, he saw shapes rushing toward him, heard the crackle of radios and the distant, blessed sound of his country's flag flapping in the wind. It had taken 6 days, one broken map and a will forged in fire, but he had made it. And now, against every odd the war could throw, his brothers would live. By the time Sergeant Daniel Harrow awoke in the medic tent, his hands were wrapped in bandages, his skin raw and blistered from frostbite. The soft beeping of equipment and the murmur of distant voices told him he was back behind Allied lines. The scent of disinfectant filled the air, a strange comfort after days of smoke and decay. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, still trapped in that endless snow. Then he saw the doctor, a young lieutenant with weary eyes, lean over him. "You're lucky, Sergeant," the doctor said softly. "Another few hours and you'd have lost those hands." Daniel tried to speak, but his throat was raw. "My men, the farmhouse," he croaked. "They're still out there." The doctor hesitated. "You came from deep behind German lines?" Daniel nodded weakly. 6 miles east of Lichtenwald. 4 men, Jenkins, Miller, Thomas, and Grant. They're holed up. "No food, little ammo." The doctor's expression changed. He didn't need to say anything. Daniel knew the truth. Most in his position would be told to rest, that reconnaissance would handle it later. But later was often too late. Daniel forced himself upright, every muscle trembling. "Get me a radio," he rasped. Word spread fast. Within hours, the officers were listening, not just to a survivor's story, but to the impossible journey he had made. The coordinates he gave were vague, but his conviction was ironclad. "They're alive," he repeated, "and they're counting on me." By dawn the next day, an extraction plan was underway. The commanding officer, Colonel Reinhardt, approached Daniel as he sat on the edge of his cot, hands trembling. "You realize you shouldn't even be standing," the colonel said, his tone hard but not unkind. Daniel managed a faint smile. "Sir, I wasn't supposed to survive crossing enemy lines either." The colonel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's bring your boys home." As they loaded the jeeps and checked their weapons, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not fear, not exhaustion, but an almost sacred resolve. He had seen the worst of men, the cruelty of war, the indifference of fate, but also the spark that refused to die. When the convoy rolled out, the early light broke across the snow, painting the horizon gold. The journey back toward Lichtenwald was treacherous. The Germans had fortified positions, and patrols roamed the forests in greater numbers than before. Daniel sat in the lead jeep, scanning the tree line through fogged-up binoculars. Every bend in the road carried the weight of a possible ambush. He remembered every tree, every ruin, every sound from the days he spent crawling through that hell, as though the land itself had burned into his mind. When they reached the outskirts of the same village he had crept through days earlier, it looked even more desolate. The bakery where the young woman had hidden him was now nothing but a smoldering shell. Daniel's chest tightened. He didn't know her name, but her kindness had saved his life. War didn't just kill soldiers, it erased saviors too. They left the jeeps behind and continued on foot, moving silently through the fog. The farmhouse was still 5 miles out. Snow crunched beneath their boots, each step measured and deliberate. Occasionally, a distant artillery boom reminded them how close death always was. As the sun began to set, they reached the forest clearing Daniel recognized instantly. The twisted oak, the broken fence post. His heart pounded. He raised a fist, signaling a halt. "This is it," he whispered. "They're down there." The farmhouse stood half buried in snow, its windows shattered, the roof sagging. No movement. For a moment, Daniel feared the worst. But then, faintly, a flicker of light from the cellar window. 3 short flashes, 1 long. It was the code they had agreed on before he left. "They're alive," Daniel breathed. The rescue team moved quickly, forming a perimeter while 2 medics followed Daniel down into the cellar. The door creaked open, and the smell of damp earth and rot hit him. Inside, the air was thick and cold. Then a voice, weak but familiar. "Sarge." Daniel's throat tightened. "It's me, boys," he whispered. Stepping into the dim lantern light, Miller's face broke into a grin, his eyes glassy with disbelief. Jenkins struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a rifle for support. "We thought you were dead," he rasped. "Not yet," Daniel replied, a faint smile tugging at his cracked lips. "And I'm not leaving without you." For a moment there were no words, just the quiet sound of relief, the kind that comes when hope returns from the grave. They helped the wounded up, wrapped them in blankets, and began the long trek back toward safety. But fate, cruel as ever, wasn't finished testing them. Halfway through the forest, the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the silence. The Germans had spotted their movement. Bullets tore through branches, snow exploding around them. Daniel yelled for cover, pushing Jenkins behind a fallen log. The soldiers returned fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night. "Keep moving," Daniel shouted. "We're not stopping here." One of the medics was hit, collapsing in the snow. Daniel ran to him, dragging him behind cover even as bullets zipped past his head. The man's breath came in ragged gasps. Daniel pressed a hand to his wound, whispering, "You're gonna make it. Just hold on." He didn't. Daniel closed the man's eyes and turned back toward his men. "Go," he roared. "Now!" They pushed forward, weaving through the trees, the gunfire fading as they reached the frozen stream near the ridge. Daniel fired one last burst to cover their retreat before diving after them. His hands burned from the recoil, but adrenaline kept him going. When they finally broke through to open ground, Daniel collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. Behind them, the forest glowed with distant flares. Ahead, Allied signal lights blinking through the mist. The nightmare was over. As medics rushed to help the wounded, Daniel stood apart, staring at the horizon. His mind replayed the journey, the miles of snow, the faces of the dead, the strangers who had risked everything to help him. He had crossed enemy lines twice, not for glory or medals, but because he refused to let his men die forgotten in a frozen corner of the world. Colonel Reinhardt met him at the camp entrance, eyes wide with disbelief. "You actually did it," he said quietly. "You brought them back." Daniel's voice was hoarse. They were never mine to lose. In the days that followed, the story spread through the ranks like wildfire, the sergeant who defied death and command alike to save his brothers. Reporters wanted interviews, officers wanted commendations, but Daniel kept silent. When someone asked him how he managed it, he simply said, "I kept walking." What no one saw were the nights afterward, when he would sit alone outside the tents, staring into the darkness. He would think of the woman in the bakery, the medic who didn't make it, and the countless others lost to the war's hunger. Survival, he had learned, wasn't victory. It was a burden, one carried for those who couldn't. Yet in that burden lay something sacred, a promise. That no matter how far one had to walk, no matter how many times death came close, there would always be someone who refused to stop moving forward. And that was Daniel Harrow's legacy. Not medals, not parades, but the simple, unbreakable truth that courage, even when alone, can hold the line between despair and deliverance. The night had fallen thick and merciless when Sergeant Daniel Harrow and his battered group finally reached the ravine. The wind howled across the barren ridges like a chorus of ghosts, hollow, endless, and cold enough to sting the soul. Their breath hung in the air, visible in thin wisps that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Behind them, the faint hum of distant German engines reminded them that the danger hadn't ended. If anything, it had only changed shape. Daniel crouched behind a snow-covered boulder, scanning the slope below. The valley stretched out into darkness, silent, featureless, yet alive with unseen eyes. He could almost feel the enemy out there, waiting. The map in his hand was barely legible, smudged and torn from days of use, but he knew this terrain by heart now. Every ridge, every tree line, every sound. He pointed east, where a narrow path wound between the cliffs. "That's our way out," he whispered. Miller, still limping from a bullet graze, shook his head. "That's suicide, Sarge. They'll have it watched." "We can't go through open ground." Daniel's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. "They'll be watching the main road. This path's too narrow for vehicles. If we move at night and stay low, we've got a chance." "Barely," Jenkins muttered, tightening the strap on his rifle. "Barely's all we need," Daniel said. They waited for the moon to slip behind the clouds, then began their descent. The snow crunched underfoot, muffled by the heavy silence that clung to them. Every step was a test of nerve. Daniel led the way, counting his breaths, scanning for movement. He felt the weight of every life behind him, men who trusted him, who had followed him through madness because he'd never once hesitated. But that night, he did. Halfway down the ravine, he spotted them, dark shapes moving along the ridge ahead, silhouettes against the faint light of the snow. German patrol, 3 men, rifles slung, voices carried faintly through the wind. Daniel froze and raised a fist. The others halted immediately, crouching low. The enemy soldiers stopped, scanning the darkness. One of them took a few steps toward the slope, his boots crunching in the snow. Daniel's pulse thundered. He reached slowly for his pistol, but his hand trembled. A single gunshot would bring a dozen more. He turned to Jenkins and whispered, "Wait for my signal. Stay down." Then, with the same reckless courage that had defined his entire journey, he slipped silently from cover and began to move, a shadow among shadows. The patrolman was only a few yards away now, fumbling with a cigarette, his rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. Daniel lunged. The 2 men went down hard, rolling into the snow. The Germans shouted in surprise, but Daniel clamped a hand over his mouth, driving his knife into the man's side. The struggle was brief, brutal. When it ended, Daniel lay still, panting, the man motionless beneath him. He looked up. The other 2 patrolmen had vanished. A faint whistle cut through the air, followed by a flare arcing upward. The light exploded in the sky, bathing the ravine in blinding white. "Run!" Daniel roared. The team bolted down the slope as machine gun fire erupted behind them. Bullets tore through the snow, chipping bark, slicing past their ears. Daniel fired back blindly, covering their retreat, his pistol cracking in the chaos. He felt the sting of a round graze his arm, but he didn't stop. They stumbled into a grove of trees, breath ragged, hearts pounding. "We need to keep moving," Daniel gasped. "They'll be on us any second." But then came the unmistakable growl of engines, trucks, German reinforcements. The rumble echoed through the valley like thunder. They were trapped. Daniel scanned the terrain desperately, and then he saw it. A half-frozen stream cutting through the rocks, leading west toward the Allied lines. It wasn't a road, but it was a path. "In the river!" he shouted. Without hesitation, they plunged into the freezing water. The shock hit them like a hammer, the cold biting deep into their bones, but it masked their tracks, their scent, their sound. Daniel could barely feel his legs as they waded forward, half crawling, half swimming through the icy current. Above them, flashlights swept the ridge. Voices shouted in German. Flares hissed through the air, turning night into day. But the soldiers didn't see them, not yet. Daniel pressed on, teeth chattering, his muscles screaming. "Just a little further," he kept whispering. "Just a little more." They followed the river until it widened into a marshy stretch, the trees thinning. Ahead, Daniel spotted something impossible, the faint glimmer of Allied signal flares. Safety. Home. But as they stumbled toward it, a sharp crack split the air. A sniper. Jenkins went down instantly, the snow blooming red beneath him. "Miller! Smoke!" Daniel barked, dropping to the ground. Miller fumbled a smoke grenade from his belt and hurled it downslope. It exploded in a thick grey cloud blanketing the field. Daniel crawled to Jenkins' side. The young soldier's eyes fluttered open, blood staining his lips. "Go," Jenkins whispered. "Don't stop for me." Daniel gripped his shoulder. "You're coming with us." Jenkins tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze. "You always were too stubborn, Sarge." Another bullet hissed past. Daniel dragged him through the snow, every inch feeling heavier than the last. The others laid down covering fire, the rattle of rifles echoing through the smoke. When they finally reached the tree line, Jenkins was gone. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, a silent prayer, a promise made in the roar of war. Then he turned and led the rest onward. By dawn, they stumbled out of the forest, frostbitten, exhausted, half dead, and collapsed into the waiting arms of Allied medics. The men were rushed to safety, but Daniel stood apart, staring back at the horizon. The sun was rising over the battlefield, golden light spilling across the snow, turning everything quiet again. The radio crackled with news of their return. Commanders wanted details, but Daniel said little. He just stared at his frostbitten hands, the same hands that had carried maps, rifles, and now the memory of those he couldn't save. A junior officer approached him hesitantly. "Sergeant, they say you walked through enemy lines twice."
"How did you do it?"
Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the smoke curling from the far hills, then down at the muddy ground beneath his boots. "You don't think about it," he said finally. "You just walk. Because stopping means someone else dies." The officer nodded quietly, not sure what to say. Later that day, when Daniel's surviving men were loaded into ambulances, one of them, Private Miller, called out, "Sarge, what now?" Daniel turned to him, his face pale beneath the grime. "Now," he said softly. "Now we rest. Then we start walking again." That night, as he sat alone by the campfire, Daniel took out something from his jacket, a small dog tag. Jenkins' tag. He turned it over in his hands, the metal still cold. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of distant gunfire. He whispered almost to himself, "We made it home, kid. All of us." It wasn't true. Not all of them had made it. But in that moment, in that fragile silence, it felt real enough. And somewhere in the ashes of war, the story of one man, the soldier who had walked alone through enemy territory to bring his men home, became legend. Not because of the medals or the headlines, but because when the world demanded surrender, he chose the harder path, the one that led back, the one that meant never leaving anyone behind. As the night stretched into a silent, frost-bitten abyss, Private Samuel Carter, mud caked on his boots, breath rising in thin white clouds, pressed onward through the ruins of northern France. He had walked alone across Nazi territory for weeks now, driven by one unshakable purpose, to bring his captured men home. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he refused to let his resolve crack. His comrades, Lieutenant Harris, Corporal Miller, and the rest, were being held in a German outpost, rumored to be near the Meuse River. The odds were impossible, yet impossibility had stopped mattering a long time ago. The closer Samuel got to the enemy line, the more surreal the world became. Entire villages lay in ghostly silence, windows shattered, doors hanging open as though waiting for someone who never came back. Once he found an abandoned farmhouse, its walls burned black and the air still reeking of gunpowder. Inside, he discovered a child's toy soldier lying in the ashes. He picked it up, stared at it, and tucked it into his jacket. It was a small reminder of innocence, of purpose, of everything he was trying to protect. At dawn, he reached a hill overlooking the enemy encampment. Through the scope of a stolen rifle, he could see them, his men, tied, beaten but alive. They were guarded by 5 Nazi soldiers, one of whom smoked casually while pacing around the prisoners. Samuel's heart pounded. He could almost hear Harris's voice, calm and commanding, echoing in his mind. Never rush the plan, Carter. A reckless move cost lives, so he waited, all day, hidden beneath a camouflage of dirt and torn cloth. He studied their movements, the guard rotations, the sound of boots, the shift in patrol timing. When the sun sank below the horizon and the campfire lit up the small clearing, Samuel finally moved. He crept down the slope with the precision of a predator. Each sound, a crack of a twig, a low whistle of wind, made his muscles tense. The cold bit at his fingers as he tightened his grip on the rifle. From the distance he could hear laughter, German soldiers sharing a bottle, oblivious to the shadow slipping through the grass. One guard broke off, walking toward the edge of the camp to relieve himself. Samuel seized the moment. He lunged from the darkness, muffling the man's gasp with his hand, and driving a knife silently into his side. The soldier's body went limp. Samuel dragged him into the shadows, heart pounding in his ears like artillery fire. He replaced the man's uniform jacket and helmet, smearing dirt across his own face. Then, with chilling calm, he walked right into the camp. The German soldiers barely glanced his way. He could hear his men now, whispering weakly, their voices hoarse. "Carter?" Miller's disbelief almost gave them away. Samuel shot him a warning glance, then signaled him to stay quiet. He moved behind the second guard, his stolen helmet casting just enough shadow to hide his face. The moment the guard turned, Samuel struck. Knife to throat, another body lowered silently. Panic began to rise in his chest as one of the Germans turned to see what was happening. A single gunshot cracked through the stillness. Then chaos erupted. The Nazis shouted, firing blindly into the dark. Samuel dove behind a crate, bullets shredding the wood around him. He fired back 2 clean shots, both hitting their marks. Harris and Miller hit the ground to avoid crossfire, shouting his name now. The last guard ran toward the radio tent, desperate to call for reinforcements. Samuel chased him down, tackling him just outside the camp's perimeter. They struggled violently, fists and boots slamming into frozen dirt. Finally, Samuel grabbed the soldier's own pistol and pulled the trigger. The man collapsed, his radio sputtering static. The silence that followed felt heavier than any explosion. Samuel rose slowly, panting, hands shaking. He turned back toward the prisoners, cutting their ropes one by one. Harris stared at him, eyes wide. "You walked here?" "Alone?" he asked. Samuel didn't answer. He just looked toward the horizon, where the faint orange glow of dawn was starting to appear. "We're not safe yet," he said. "So we move now." Their journey back through occupied France was a blur of exhaustion and instinct. The men were weak, some barely able to walk, but Samuel carried them, sometimes literally, through forests and across rivers. They scavenged food from abandoned farms, slept in trenches, and hid from German patrols so close they could hear the dogs breathing. One night, when morale was collapsing, Samuel gathered them around a dying campfire. He looked at each of them, his eyes hollow but burning with determination. "You all remember what Harris said before we got captured?" he began. "He said if one of us gets out, we come back for the rest. I didn't do anything special, I just followed orders." The men chuckled weakly, but that moment rekindled something inside them. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was pride. It was brotherhood. Days later, they reached the edge of Allied territory, but as they approached, they saw smoke rising from a German convoy parked directly in their path. The soldiers froze. They were trapped again, between home and hell. Samuel turned to his men. "Stay down," he whispered. "I'll draw them off." Harris grabbed his arm. "You're not doing this again alone." But Samuel only smiled faintly. "This time, I'm not leaving anyone behind." He sprinted toward the convoy, firing at the nearest truck. Bullets erupted in return. The Germans scrambled, shouting orders, chasing the lone figure zigzagging through the trees. Behind them, his men crawled forward unseen. One by one, they slipped past the chaos toward Allied lines. Samuel's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it and dove into a ditch, pulling a grenade from his belt. His last thought was of the toy soldier still tucked inside his jacket. He pulled the pin, whispered a prayer, and hurled it into the truck's fuel tank. The explosion tore through the forest, lighting up the sky. The sound echoed for miles. When the Allied soldiers found the group hours later, Harris led them back to the smoldering wreckage. All they found of Samuel was his helmet, and that tiny toy soldier, scorched but intact, lying beside it. Years later, long after the war ended, that toy soldier sat in a glass case at a military museum. The plaque beneath it read, "Private Samuel Carter, the man who walked alone." Visitors still stopped to read it, some whispering in disbelief, others standing in silence. Because even in the chaos of war, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks, quietly alone through the heart of darkness, just to bring its brothers home. In the years that followed the war, stories of heroism filled history books and documentaries. Great generals, decisive battles, political speeches. But among veterans, one name lingered like a quiet hymn passed down in hushed tones: Private Samuel Carter. His story was never one of medals or headlines, but of endurance. Of a man who carried duty in his bones and brotherhood in his heart. When the official war ended, his war, his inner struggle, had long been over. Because Samuel hadn't fought for flags or fame. He had fought for faces, the faces of his brothers who trusted him when everything else was falling apart. When the surviving men from his unit returned home, their tales became the backbone of what would one day be recognized as one of the most selfless acts of the Second World War. Lieutenant Harris, the officer Samuel had risked everything to save, spent years giving lectures to cadets, often telling them about the man who walked through hell alone. Courage, he would say, isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else matters more. Every time he spoke those words, he would glance at a photograph of Samuel, mud-streaked, weary, but smiling faintly in his uniform. The military eventually awarded Samuel the Silver Star posthumously, though the medal itself sat gathering dust in a box for decades. What mattered more were the stories. The soldiers he saved had children and grandchildren who grew up hearing about the man who refused to give up. Some of them even joined the army, saying they wanted to live up to the name Carter. That legacy became its own quiet kind of immortality. Years after the war, a young historian named Claire Donovan stumbled upon an old field journal in an army archive. It was worn, water-stained, and signed with faded initials. SC inside were short notes written in the margins, fragments of thoughts that revealed more about Samuel than any official record ever could. "If fear doesn't stop you, hunger won't either." Another read, "I don't know how far I'll make it, but if I can reach them, it'll be worth it." Claire was moved to tears. She spent months piecing together his path, his crossing through enemy lines, the villages he passed, the nights he nearly froze to death. Eventually, she published a small book titled The Man Who Walked Alone. It didn't sell millions of copies, but among soldiers and veterans, it became something sacred, a story of human grit stripped of glory and fanfare. The world moved on as it always does. Cities were rebuilt, lives were remade, and memories of war faded into textbooks. But one summer morning, decades later, Harris, now a frail old man in a wheelchair, visited the military museum where Samuel's toy soldier was displayed. It sat in a glass case beneath the gentle hum of fluorescent lights, a tiny piece of wood that had somehow survived both war and time. Harris reached out, pressing his trembling hand against the glass. "We made it home," he whispered softly. "Just like you said we would." A few visitors nearby paused, sensing the quiet reverence of the moment. They didn't know the story, not really. Not the hunger, not the pain, not the endless cold, but something in Harris's voice made them stop and listen. Because even without understanding, they could feel it. The kind of courage that doesn't fade, the kind that doesn't need applause. In truth, Samuel Carter never considered himself a hero. He was just a man who couldn't bear to leave others behind. That single conviction, so simple yet so powerful, became the thread that connected every soldier who ever heard his story. For many veterans, his name became a kind of code. When they found themselves alone, afraid or uncertain, they'd say quietly, "Remember Carter." It was enough to remind them that sometimes one person's will can outlast a war, Claire's book inspired a film decades later, a modest, independent production that dramatized his journey through Nazi territory. It wasn't flashy. It didn't show Samuel as a superhuman, but as a shivering, exhausted, terrified man who kept moving anyway. The final scene depicted him limping toward the rising sun, his shadow stretching long behind him, while his voice narrated softly, You don't need to be fearless to be brave. You just need to walk, one step at a time. Audiences wept. Veterans wrote letters, and in a small ceremony years after, Samuel's surviving relatives finally received recognition from the government for his sacrifice. They placed his medal beside that same toy soldier, the two symbols resting side by side, the weaponless innocence of a toy and the hardened valor of a man. Together, they told the entire story of war, destruction, hope, and the fragile beauty of humanity that somehow survives it all. Generations later, school children on field trips stopped at the exhibit, staring at the case in wonder. Guides would explain who Samuel was, how he'd walked alone through Nazi territory, how he'd freed his comrades and given his life so they could live. And even though most of those children couldn't yet comprehend the full depth of sacrifice, something in the tale stayed with them, a quiet echo of courage whispering through time, because that's the strange truth about acts of selflessness. They ripple. The world forgets names, battles, dates, but it never forgets meaning. Every person who stood a little taller in the face of fear, every soldier who decided to turn back for a friend, every civilian who refused to let cruelty win, they all carried a spark from men like Samuel Carter. In the end, the war that took millions of lives also revealed millions of moments of compassion and loyalty that defined what humanity could be at its best. Samuel's story became one of those rare reminders that the measure of a man isn't written in how loudly he fights, but in how quietly he endures. When visitors leave the museum, they often pass by a quote carved into the marble near the exit. It reads, "He walked alone so others would not have to." It doesn't name Samuel, but it doesn't have to, because by then they already know, and somewhere, in the stillness between memory and myth, the ghost of a soldier still walks across that ruined landscape, boots crunching softly in the frost, carrying with him the unbreakable promise of brotherhood that no war could ever destroy. In the chaos of World War II, one man's act of loyalty became a timeless symbol of human courage. Private Samuel Carter didn't command armies or lead grand offensives. He simply refused to abandon his men. Walking alone through Nazi-occupied territory, he faced hunger, exhaustion, and death itself, driven by nothing but a promise to bring his brothers home. His journey wasn't about medals or glory, it was about heart. Decades later, his legacy continues to remind the world that real heroism often happens in silence, when no one is watching. Stories like Samuel's are why we still talk about World War II, not just for the battles, but for the people who found light in the darkest of places. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor those who fought, not just for victory, but for each other. Subscribe for more untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and humanity that history almost forgot, but shouldn't.